The paper sat on the table like a loaded gun, and Bessie Leland had been staring at it for the better part of an hour before she finally pushed back her chair and walked out of the lawyer's office without a single word. The town of Redemption, New Mexico Territory, breathed hot and dry in the summer of 1882, and Bessie breathed it in deeply as she stepped onto the wooden boardwalk and let the door swing shut behind her. The sound of it clicking into its frame was the most satisfying thing she had heard all week. Out in the street, a pair of horses stood hitched to a post, tails flicking lazily at flies, and somewhere down the way, a man was hammering nails into a roof with steady, unhurried strokes. The whole town carried on as though nothing had changed, and maybe for Redemption it had not, but for Bessie Leland, everything had just shifted on its axis. She was 24 years old, and she had spent every one of those years in the West. Born in a wagon crossing through what would eventually become the Arizona Territory, raised on the dry edge of the New Mexico high desert, she knew red rock and scrub brush, and the particular quality of silence that settled over the land just before a summer storm. She did not know parlors. She did not know gaslit drawing rooms or afternoon teas, or the kind of soft laughter that floated through the open windows of the Philadelphia townhouse her mother's sister had described in the letter that accompanied the paper. The paper had arrived 3 days after Bessie buried her father. Thomas Leland had died the way he had lived, stubbornly and without much ceremony, going quickly of a fever that took him in 4 days. He left behind a small cattle operation on the edge of 212 acres, a paint horse named Tuesday, a barn that needed new shingles on the south side, 4 good hands who had worked the place for years, and a daughter who had no intention of letting any of it slip away. What Thomas Leland had also left behind, though he had never told Bessie directly, was a debt. Not a crippling one, not the kind of debt that swallowed men whole in those years, but enough. Enough that her mother's sister, Cornelia Hartfield, had apparently gotten wind of it through some channel Bessie could not quite trace, and enough that Cornelia had dispatched a lawyer named Gerald Fitch all the way from Philadelphia to Redemption, New Mexico Territory, with a document and a proposition. The proposition was this: sign the deed of the Leland land over to a land-holding company that Cornelia's husband had a considerable interest in, settle the debt from the proceeds, and come home to Philadelphia where a room had been prepared, where a position in the household had been arranged, where a suitable match could be made, and where Bessie Leland would never again have to worry about drought or debt or whether the cattle would make weight at the fall auction. It was, Gerald Fitch had explained with his soft Eastern hands folded on the table, a generous offer, a merciful offer, even. He had looked at her the way men looked at problems they expected to solve before supper. Bessie had looked at the paper. She had looked at the pen. She had looked at the mountains visible through the grimy window of the lawyer's borrowed office, blue and solid and permanent against the white sky. She had stood up and walked out. Now she stood on the boardwalk with the afternoon pressing down on her shoulders and her heart hammering with the particular ferocity of a decision freshly made, and she thought about what came next. The debt was real. She knew that. She needed to think clearly, needed to get back to the ranch, needed to speak with her foreman, a steady older man named Hector Vega who had worked for her father for 11 years and who knew the land as well as she did. She needed a plan that did not involve signing away everything her father had built. She was stepping off the boardwalk toward where her own horse was tied when she heard the commotion. It came from the direction of the livery, which was 2 buildings down on the right, and it was the sound of a horse in distress, high and sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the ordinary sounds of the afternoon. Bessie turned without thinking, because that was the kind of woman she was, and she walked quickly toward the noise. The livery yard was open to the street, and inside it, a scene was working itself out with the kind of speed that demanded immediate attention. A tall bay gelding was rearing up in the center of the yard, whites of its eyes showing, foam beginning at the corners of its mouth, and the rope attached to its halter was wrapped around the post in such a way that if the horse came down wrong, it would break something. There were two men standing back with the particular posture of men who wanted to look like they were about to do something without actually committing to doing it. And there was one man in the middle of the yard moving toward the horse with slow, deliberate steps, speaking in a low, steady voice. Bessie stopped at the fence rail and watched. The man was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate when they could, with dark hair pressed flat under a battered brown hat, and the kind of sun-darkened skin that came from years under the territory sky. He moved toward the horse with his hands low and open, and his voice, though Bessie could not make out the words from where she stood, had a quality to it that she felt more than heard, a rumble and a steadiness that seemed to be reaching the horse even as the animal kept tossing its head. The horse came down from its rear, hooves striking the packed dirt hard, and the man stepped sideways to avoid the swing of the animal's head. He did not flinch. He spoke again, and this time the horse blew out through its nose, a long shuddering breath, and the ears that had been flat back began to swivel forward, tentatively, the way a frightened animal tests trust. The man reached up slowly and laid one hand on the horse's neck, just below the jaw, and the horse went still. It was one of those moments that seemed to deserve quiet, and the two bystanders, who had contributed nothing but standing, seemed to sense it, because they did not speak. Bessie found herself holding her own breath. The man worked the rope free from around the post with his other hand, keeping his palm against the horse's neck the whole time, and then he led the animal in a slow circle, murmuring, until the gelding was moving with its head down and its breath coming normally. He brought the horse to the fence on the far side and tied it properly, gave it a long stroke along the neck, and then turned and looked directly at Bessie. She had not moved. She was still at the fence rail with her hands resting on the top board and the full weight of her attention on him, and when his eyes found hers, there was a moment of frank, mutual assessment. His eyes were dark, the color of strong coffee, and they held a kind of settled quality that she recognized as a quality she respected, the look of a person who had made peace with what the world was. He walked toward her, pulling off his hat as he did, which she noted. "That rope was wrapped wrong," she said, because it was true, and because it was easier than saying whatever else was in her chest at that moment. "It was," he agreed. He had reached the fence now and stood on the other side of it from her, hat in his hand. Up close she could see that he was perhaps 28 or 29, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in 3 or 4 days and a quality about his face that suggested he was the kind of man who thought before he spoke. "You know horses." "I was raised with them," Bessie said. "That's a good animal. He shouldn't have been left tied like that in this heat." "I know it," the man said. "He's not mine. I came in to settle my own horse and found him already worked up." He paused. "I'm Peter Barnett. I've got a spread about 9 miles east of here, out toward the Sanger Range." "Bessie Leland," she said. "My father had the Leland place, South Fork of the Marta Creek Road." Something shifted in his expression, subtle and careful. "Thomas Leland's daughter," he said. "I heard about your father. I'm sorry for it. He was a good man. Bought my first good bull from him back in '78. "That would have been Absalom," Bessie said, and a small, involuntary warmth moved through her at the naming of the bull, because her father had named every animal on the place and had always called her his best brand inspector because she remembered every one of them. "Big red Hereford with the crooked left horn." Peter Barnett smiled, and it changed his whole face. "That's the one," he said. "Made my whole herd. I never forgot it." They looked at each other through the fence, and the afternoon hummed around them, and Bessie thought that under any other circumstances she might have stood there a good deal longer. But the weight of the morning sat heavy on her, the lawyer and the paper and the long walk back to what she had to figure out, and she straightened up and picked up the reins she had set over the fence post. "I have to get back," she said. "Of course," Peter said. He put his hat back on. "Miss Leland. If you need anything at all with the place, I mean, we're neighbors. That counts for something out here." She looked at him for a moment. "It does," she agreed, and swung up onto her horse and rode south. The ride back to the Leland place took 40 minutes, and Bessie spent them thinking. The land rolled out around her, red and gold and patched with juniper and pinon, and the sky above was the particular blue of a late New Mexico summer afternoon that she had loved since she was small. She had never seriously considered leaving this. She did not think she was capable of it. Whatever Cornelia Hartfield thought she was offering, whatever Gerald Fitch had implied about the practical wisdom of accepting the proposition, none of them seemed to understand that, for Bessie, the land and the life were not a burden to be relieved of. They were simply what she was made of. Hector Vega was in the yard when she rode in, mending harness on the low bench outside the barn, and he looked up when she came through the gate with the patient, steady look of a man who had been waiting for news and had prepared himself for more than one kind of it. "I didn't sign," Bessie told him, swinging down. Hector nodded slowly, as though he had expected this but was glad of it all the same. He was 61 years old, with a face like worn leather and gray in the dark hair under his old hat, and he had loved the Leland place in his way for more than a decade. "Your father would not have signed either," he said. "I know it," Bessie said. "We've got to figure this out, Hector. The debt is real and it won't wait forever. What do we have going into fall?" They went inside and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Thomas Leland had eaten 10,000 meals, and they spread out what they knew. There were 140 head of cattle that would be ready for the fall drive, and if prices held in Santa Fe and the drive went well, it would be enough to settle most of what was owed to the bank in Las Cruces. Not all of it, but most. There were also 60 acres on the east end of the property that sat fallow and that Hector thought might be sold off without losing the core of the operation, enough land to graze the herd and still hold the water rights on Marta Creek. "If we sell the east 60 and make the drive," Bessie said, "we can settle the full debt." "If prices hold," Hector said carefully. "Prices will hold," Bessie said. "There's a good market this year. The rail connections out of Albuquerque have been drawing buyers in. I've been watching it." Hector looked at her with something that was not quite a smile but was close to it. "You sound like your father when you talk like that." "Good," Bessie said, and she meant it with everything she had. The next weeks moved fast. Bessie threw herself into the work with a focused intensity that left her tired enough each night to sleep without thinking too hard about anything, which was what she needed. There were cattle to assess, hands to coordinate, fencing on the North Range that had come down in a late summer storm and needed resetting before the fall gather. There was also Gerald Fitch, who had not gone back to Philadelphia. He had taken a room at the hotel in Redemption, and he appeared at the ranch gate every third or fourth day with some new version of his proposition, each one slightly adjusted, slightly more pressured, like a man who had been told to bring back a signature and was beginning to understand that it was not going to come easily. Bessie was polite to him in the way that a person could be polite while being entirely immovable. She offered him water when it was hot. She did not invite him inside. She listened to what he said and then told him, each time with the same calm finality, that she had not changed her mind and she was not going to. What she did not say, because it was none of Gerald Fitch's business, was that she had begun to understand the fuller dimensions of what the land-holding company behind Cornelia's husband actually intended for the Leland acres. It had taken a conversation with the county clerk in Redemption and an afternoon with old land filings to see it clearly. The east range of the Leland property sat squarely over the best approach to a water source that a proposed rail spur would need access to in order to run south toward the Texas border. The land that Cornelia's husband's company wanted was not a kindness toward a niece in debt. It was a business move worth considerably more than the debt itself. Knowing this made Bessie feel not angry exactly, but clarified. The way a lens clarified what was far away, bringing it close and distinct. She was not being rescued. She was being maneuvered. The distinction mattered to her very much. She was coming back from the North Range with two of her hands, a young man named Cal and an older one named Luther, on a Tuesday afternoon in early September when she saw Peter Barnett's horse at the gate. He was there, hat in hand again, and this time he had a neighbor beside him, a woman named Agnes Whitfield, who was married to the man who ran the feed operation and who had a reputation for being the most practical person in the valley. "Miss Leland," Peter said, "I heard Fitch was out here again. I hope I'm not intruding." Bessie was dusty and her hair had come half out of its braid, and she was not particularly interested in how she looked, but she was aware of it in that abstract, involuntary way. "You're not intruding," she said. "Come inside." Agnes Whitfield had brought a pie, which Bessie recognized as the New Mexico Territory's version of a calling card, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table while Agnes poured coffee from the pot that was always on, and Peter Barnett set his hat on his knee and looked at Bessie with the careful, direct look she had already come to recognize as his way. "There's something you should know about what Fitch is trying to do," Peter said. "I don't know how much you've figured out on your own, but there's a group of us in the valley, me and the Whitfields and the Garcias over on the West Fork, who have been watching what Hartfield's company has been doing with land purchases in this part of the territory. They've bought up 3 other operations in the past 2 years, and every one of them the owners thought they were getting a fair deal and discovered afterward they weren't." "The Dawson place," Agnes said, nodding. "They had no idea what they were sitting on until it was already signed away." "I know what I'm sitting on," Bessie said. Peter looked at her steadily. "I had a feeling you might," he said. "The water approach for the proposed rail spur," Bessie said. "My East Range is the corridor. Without it, they have to route 20 miles further north, which changes the whole economics of the project." Peter blinked once, and she saw something move through his expression that she thought was genuine respect, the kind that landed differently than the performed kind. "That is exactly right," he said, "and they know it, which is why they'll keep sending Fitch." "He's going to start applying pressure through the bank," Agnes said. "Robert has been hearing things. They may try to call the note early, which technically the bank has the right to do under the terms if they can claim a material change in the operation's circumstances." "Can they make that claim?" Peter asked, looking at Bessie. "They can try," Bessie said. "But my fall drive is on schedule and I've got a buyer lined up in Santa Fe who will give me a fair price. If I can get the cattle to market before they can move on the note, I settle the debt and the leverage disappears." "When's your drive planned?" Peter asked. "First week of October," Bessie said, "weather permitting." "You're 4 hands short of what a drive that size needs," Peter said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of a problem. "Your father ran 6 hands on the fall drive. You've got 4. Bessie was quiet for a moment, because he was right and she had been trying not to think about it directly. She had Calvin and Luther and 2 other hands named Dorodio and Frank, and all of them were good men. But the drive to Santa Fe with 140 head through the Sanger foothills was going to push them. "I have a proposal," Peter said, and his voice was careful in a way that suggested he had thought about how to say this before he came. "I'm taking my own herd north in the same week, just over 80 head. If we combine the drives, we've got plenty of hands between us. We split the trail costs, and we're both stronger on the road than we'd be separately. There's safety in numbers on that pass. Always has been." Bessie looked at him. The kitchen was warm, the smell of Agnes's pie drifting from the counter where it was cooling, and outside the window the afternoon light was golden on the red hills. She thought about the last thing her father had ever said to her, which was to trust the neighbors before she trusted anyone who came from a distance to help. "Why?" she asked, because she needed to hear it said plainly. "Because I knew your father and he was a good man and what's being done to you is wrong," Peter Barnett said simply. "And because I am your neighbor, and because out here those things mean something." Agnes was looking at her pie very carefully. Bessie looked at Peter Barnett for a long moment. "All right," she said. "We'll combine the drives." In the days that followed, there was more contact between them than there had been in all the years their families had been neighbors, which Bessie supposed was often the way of things. He came by twice more that first week to coordinate the route and the timing, and both times he stayed long enough to look at her cattle with the professional eye of a man who knew what he was looking at, and to talk over logistics with Hector with a kind of straightforward respect that Bessie noticed and appreciated. Hector, who was not a man who warmed to people easily, seemed to warm to Peter Barnett. She rode over to his place once, the Barnett homestead, which sat in a wide, shallow bowl of land with the mountains behind it, and a good creek running through the middle, and a solid stone house that his father had built and that Peter had added onto in recent years. He had a sister, he told her, who lived in Albuquerque now, married to a merchant, and his parents were both gone, his father in '76 and his mother 2 years after. He had been running the place alone since he was 22. 6 years, Bessie said, doing the arithmetic. 6 years, he confirmed. He was showing her the corrals where his cattle were being sorted for the drive, and they were standing at the fence with their arms resting on the top rail, and the cattle moved below them in the afternoon light. "It's good land," he said. "I don't say that to brag. I say it because I think the land here is worth fighting for." "I know it is," Bessie said. He looked at her sidelong. "How are you holding up, truly?" It was a simple question, direct and quiet, and it caught her off guard in a way that fancier conversation never would have. She thought about giving him the practical answer, the one about the drive schedule and the debt figures, but something about the way he was looking at her, with the same careful, settled quality she had noticed the day with the horse in the livery yard, made her answer differently. "Some days are harder than others," she said. "My father and I worked this place together for the last 6 years since my mother passed. It was the two of us. I know every inch of it, and I know what it needs, and I know I can do this. But there are mornings when I wake up and the quiet in the house is wrong, and I have to remind myself that the place is still there and still mine, and that is enough." "It is enough," Peter said quietly. "The land is still there." "Yes," Bessie said. And then, because she was not in the habit of talking about hard things without immediately following them with action, she said, "Tell me about your water situation on the South Range." "I was thinking about the route through the lower foothills, and there's a spring about 6 miles in that may be running low this time of year." He told her, and they talked for another hour leaning on that fence rail, and when she rode home in the late afternoon, the ride seemed shorter than the ride out had been, which she noted and set aside in the back of her mind, where things she was not ready to examine directly tended to live for a while. Gerald Fitch appeared at the ranch gate 4 days before the drive was set to depart. This time he had a man with him, a man who was not a lawyer but who wore his suit in the way of lawyers, tight and self-important, and who introduced himself as a representative of the First Territorial Bank of Las Cruces. "Miss Leland," Fitch said, and he had the slightly sick look of a man who was doing something he knew was not quite right but had been paid enough to do it anyway. "I need to inform you that due to a material review of your current operation, the bank has decided to revisit the terms of the outstanding note. There is a concern about the herd's liquidity and the question of whether the note can be serviced in the current term." Bessie looked at the two of them from the other side of the gate. Behind her, Cal and Doroteo were moving cattle in the near pasture, and the sound and smell of the herd was all around her. "The note has 4 months remaining on its current term," she said. "I have a signed letter of intent from a buyer in Santa Fe for my fall cattle. The drive begins in 4 days. You have no material grounds." The bank man shuffled his papers. "There is a provision, Miss Leland, under circumstances of changed management, meaning the death of the primary note holder, that allows for review of the outstanding balance. Under that provision, we would need full settlement within 30 days rather than the remaining term." "Changed management," Bessie said flatly. "I am Thomas Leland's legal heir. The operation is under the same management. I am the management." "Nevertheless," Fitch said, and there was something almost apologetic in his face now, "the formal notice has been filed and you will receive the paperwork by end of week." Bessie looked at them for a long, still moment. She thought about her father. She thought about what it had taken him to build this place, the years of dry summers and hard winters and market prices that didn't cooperate, the sheer accumulation of work and stubbornness, and love for a piece of ground that had no particular reason to be loved except that it was his and he had made it mean something. "Go file your notices," she said. "I'll be in Santa Fe settling my debt before your 30 days are up." She turned and walked back toward her cattle without watching them leave. That evening, she rode to Peter Barnett's place in the last of the light. She did not plan to. She found herself riding east on the Marta Creek Road and then turning up toward the Sanger foothills, and only consciously acknowledged what she was doing about halfway there. The mountains were dark blue in the dusk, and the first stars were showing above them, and the air had the cool, clean bite that came to the high desert in September evenings. Peter Barnett was sitting on his front step with a coffee cup in his hand when she rode in, and he looked up without surprise, as though it were not unusual for her to arrive unannounced in the gathering dark, and she supposed maybe it was not unusual anymore. "They filed a 30-day notice," she said, swinging down and tying her horse at the post. He was quiet for a moment. "Come sit down," he said. She sat on the step beside him, which was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool air, and he poured coffee from the pot he had sitting on the step beside him and handed her the cup, and she took it. The mountains were dark shapes against the sky now, and the stars were coming out thick and steady. 30 days, he said. "The drive is 4 days out. We've got the letter of intent from your Santa Fe buyer. If we push the pace, we can be there in 8 days. That's 12 total days into the notice period, leaving plenty of time for the settlement." "I know the arithmetic," Bessie said. "I just needed to say it out loud to someone who understands what it means." "I understand what it means," Peter said. She looked at him in the half-dark. His profile was clear against the sky, steady and familiar in a way that surprised her, because she had only known him properly for a few weeks. But there was something about Peter Barnett that had always seemed familiar, she thought, even when he was a stranger at a fence in a livery yard. Like a landmark you had passed many times from a distance that you finally stopped and stood next to and found that it was exactly what you had always thought it was. "I'm frightened," she said, quietly and precisely, because she believed in naming true things accurately. "Not of losing. I don't think I'm going to lose. I'm frightened of what it means that someone who is supposed to be family would do this." "Blood isn't always family," Peter said. "No," Bessie agreed. "It isn't." They sat in the quiet for a while. The coffee was strong and good. The stars spread out overhead in the particular dense manner of the territory sky, more stars than anywhere Bessie had ever been, though she had never been anywhere else, which she supposed was how she could say that with such certainty. "Can I ask you something?" Peter said. "You can ask," Bessie said. "Did you ever consider it, signing and going east?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about honest questions. She thought about the 30 seconds in the lawyer's office when she had looked at the pen and had the fleeting, weak thought that maybe it would be simpler. "For about 30 seconds, she said. "What changed in the 31st second?" he asked. "The mountains," she said, nodding toward the dark shapes on the horizon. "They were there in the window, and I thought, I know those mountains. I know exactly what they look like in the morning and in the rain and in the first snow, and whoever I would become in Philadelphia would never know them at all. And that person seemed to me like a very pale sort of person to be." Peter Barnett looked at her for a long moment in the dark. "You are the least pale person I have ever met," he said, and it was said so simply and with such directness that it landed differently than a pretty speech would have. Bessie felt the warmth of it, but she was not quite ready for that, or she told herself she was not, because there was a cattle drive in 4 days and a debt and a 30-day notice, and she needed to think clearly. So she set it in the back of her mind with the other things she was not ready to examine directly, and she finished her coffee, and she said good night, and she rode home under the stars. The morning of the drive was loud and smelled of cattle and dust, and the particular complex smell of horses in the early light. Bessie was up before dawn, moving through the familiar sequence: coffee, checking the horses, talking with Hector about the day's route, checking the provision wagon that Cal's wife had helped stock the night before. The hands were all there by first light, her 4 and Peter's 3, and when Peter Barnett himself rode in with the first sun just cutting over the eastern mountains and his hat set at the angle she had already started to know, she felt something settle in her chest, a kind of rightness about the day. "Ready?" he asked her, reining in beside her. "Let's go," she said. They moved the combined herd out through the gate and up the road toward the foothills, and the sound and mass of nearly 220 head of cattle moving together was something Bessie had always found deeply satisfying. The weight of it, the noise of it, the sense of all that living, breathing work heading toward its purpose. She rode the right flank and Peter rode the left, and the hands spread out around the herd in the practiced pattern of men who had done this before. The first 2 days were straightforward, good trail and cool nights, and the cattle moved well. Peter and Bessie rode the same flank in the evenings, after the herd was settled and the hands had their supper going, and the conversations that developed in those quiet riding hours had a different quality than any they had had before. There was something about being in motion, she thought, something about the continuous movement of a trail drive that loosened things. The particular discipline of talk that people kept in settled places seemed to relax on the trail, and what came out instead was more direct and more true. He told her about his first year alone on the Barnett place, after his mother died, when he had not quite known how to be a person without parents, and had gone through a winter that was harder inside than out. She told him about the year she turned 18, when she had considered, seriously and in detail, striking out north to try to find work in Colorado, when the ranch had been struggling, and she had thought she might be more useful earning wages than working a losing operation. She had stayed because her father had needed her, and she had been glad ever since, but she had wondered sometimes what that other life would have looked like. "Do you think you would have been happy?" Peter asked. They were riding close in the failing light. The herd settled below them on a wide flat, the smell of wood smoke drifting up from the camp. "I think I would have been competent," Bessie said. "I'm not sure that's the same thing." "It isn't," he said. "What makes you happy?" she asked. "Not what are you good at. What actually makes you happy?" He thought about it the way he thought about things, genuinely, without rushing to an answer. "This," he said, and gestured at the landscape around them, the darkening hills, the herd below, the first stars. "And good work at the end of the day. And a conversation with someone who says what they mean." He paused. "That last one is rarer than people think." Bessie looked at him. "It is," she said. On the fourth night out, the weather changed. The sky that had been clear for days began to pile up in the northwest, gray and serious, and by evening there was the smell of coming rain in the air that Bessie knew well. She and Peter spent the last hour of daylight repositioning the herd to a flatter area with better natural shelter on the windward side, and working with the hands to set the horses and the provision wagon into the most protected configuration they could manage. The rain came around midnight. It came hard and steady, and the cattle shifted and bawled in the dark, and Bessie was in the saddle for 3 hours in it, working the edges of the herd with Calvin and Doroteo, keeping them from pushing out onto the broken ground to the east. Peter was doing the same on the other side, and she could hear him in the dark, his voice carrying over the rain and the cattle noise, steady and sure. By 3 in the morning the worst of it had passed, and the herd had held together, and the only casualty was a stretch of Bessie's braid that had come completely undone, and she sat in the wet dark with her hair hanging loose and rain dripping off the brim of her hat, and thought that she was very tired and very satisfied. Peter materialized out of the dark on his horse, coming up beside her. He had a deep cut on his left hand from where a horn had caught him when he'd ridden too close trying to push a drifting steer, and he was holding it with his other hand. In the light from the camp fire that one of the hands had managed to keep going under the provision wagon, Bessie could see the cut was not serious, but it was bleeding steadily. "Let me see that," she said. He held it out, which he did without protest, which she also noted. She worked in the low light, cleaning it with the small bottle of carbolic she kept in her saddlebag with a practiced efficiency that made him watch her with an expression she chose not to examine too closely. "You've done this before," he said. "Cattle country," she said. "You learn to deal with cuts." She bandaged it with a strip of clean cloth, pulling it snug. "Keep it covered for the rest of the night and we'll look at it again in the morning." "Thank you, Bessie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name without the formal address, and neither of them commented on it, but it lay there between them in the wet dark with a particular quality. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "The north side held because of you." "The south side held because of you," he said. "We're even." She looked at him, rain-wet and steady in the firelight, and she thought that she was not yet ready to say anything about what was happening between them, the accumulating warmth and gravity of these days, but that it was very clearly happening and that she was not sorry. The last 4 days of the drive went smoothly, the weather clearing and the trail firm underfoot, and the cattle moving well with the instinct of animals who sensed they were approaching familiar territory. Santa Fe appeared before them on the morning of the 9th day, sprawled in its river valley in the particular fashion of old Spanish settlements, the adobe walls warm-colored in the morning light, and the smell of wood smoke and food rising up from the town. The buyer, a man named Ezra Kowalski, who ran a substantial cattle brokerage out of a good stone office near the plaza, was waiting for them as arranged. He was a compact, businesslike man with spectacles and a habit of making quick, precise notes in a leather-bound book, and he walked the herd with Peter and Bessie both, and at the end of it quoted them a price per head that was at the high end of what Bessie had calculated. She controlled her relief with effort. The number, when she calculated it in her head, was enough. It was enough to settle the Leland debt in full and to have a working reserve for the coming year. It was enough. She signed the sale documents with a hand that was steadier than she felt, and she noted the irony of signing this paper with relief and the other paper with nothing, and she thought that the difference between papers was everything, and that what you signed your name to was who you were. "Congratulations, Miss Leland," Ezra Kowalski said, handing her the bank draft. "Thank you," she said. When she walked out of the office into the Santa Fe Plaza, Peter was sitting on the bench outside, hat pushed back, squinting into the late afternoon sun. He looked up when she came out and he read her face before she said anything. "It was enough," he said. "It was not quite a question." "It was enough," she confirmed. He let out a breath. The smile that spread across his face was slow and genuine, and it went all the way to his eyes. And Bessie thought that she had been wrong earlier, when she had thought she was not ready, because standing in the Santa Fe Plaza in the warm autumn light with Peter Barnett smiling at her, she felt very ready for quite a lot. "We should celebrate," Peter said, standing up. "We should get to the bank first," Bessie said. He laughed, which she had not heard fully before, and it was a good laugh, unrestrained and warm. "Yes," he said. "Bank first, then celebrate." They went to the bank and settled the Leland debt in full, and Bessie walked out of the bank in Santa Fe with a receipt that represented freedom, and it felt in her chest approximately the way she imagined the sky must feel after a long, heavy cloud breaks apart. They had supper that evening at a good restaurant near the plaza, just the two of them, the hands having dispersed to their own celebrations, and it was the first time in all the weeks of driving and working and planning that they sat across a table from each other in a clean room with food that neither of them had cooked, and the particular intimacy of that distinction was not lost on either of them. They talked for 2 hours over the meal, easy and unhurried, and somewhere in the middle of it, over the remains of a very good beef stew and a glass of red wine that was better than Bessie had expected to find in Santa Fe. The conversation shifted in the way that conversations shift when they have been building toward something for a long time. "I need to ask you something," Peter said, and his voice was careful in a way that was different from his ordinary carefulness. He was looking at the table. He looked up, and I want to ask it correctly because I have been thinking about how to ask it for some time. Bessie set down her fork. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight of the restaurant. He was looking at her with the same steady, direct quality she had seen in the livery yard on the first day, and underneath it, for the first time, something that was not calm but that was hoping. "I am a plain man," he said. "I don't have the kind of words that come easy, but I know my own mind and I know what I've come to feel since September, and I would not be honest if I didn't say it. I find myself thinking about you constantly, Bessie, about what you think about things, about the way you handle yourself, about the way you said the mountains were in that window and you couldn't leave them." He paused. "I don't want to go back to 9 miles east and not see you except in town. I want more than that if you would have it. I am asking you to consider whether you might." Bessie looked at him for a long moment. Outside the restaurant, Santa Fe moved through its evening, horses and voices and the distant sound of music from somewhere, and inside it was warm and lamplight and Peter Barnett looking at her with everything he had just said still in his face. "I don't think you're a plain man," she said. "I think you are a clear one. There is a difference." "Is that a yes?" he asked, and there was the faintest edge of nervousness in it that was endearing in someone she had only ever seen be composed. "That is a yes," she said, "with the understanding that I am keeping my land and I am running my operation and I am not anyone who can be persuaded to be something she isn't." "I would not want you to be," Peter said, and the sincerity of it was absolute. "I would not change a single thing about you." She smiled at him across the table, and the smile she gave him was not the small, controlled smile of professional acquaintance or polite neighborliness, but the full, real smile of a woman who was genuinely happy, which was a rarer thing and a more valuable one. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, carefully, as though it were something to be done right, and she turned her hand over under his and let it be. They rode back toward home 3 days later, the drive done and the hands dispersed, and the two of them on the long road south through the Territory Hills. The riding was easy and unhurried, and the world was full of color in the early October light, the gold of the aspens catching the sun in the higher elevations, and the warm red of the low hills, and the sky that particular uncompromising blue. They talked as they rode, and were quiet as they rode, and both the talking and the quiet felt natural and right. 2 days out from Redemption, they stopped at a creek to water the horses in the middle of the afternoon, and the water ran clear and cold over round stones, and the cottonwoods along the bank were fully gold, shaking in a light wind. Bessie was sitting on a flat rock with her boots off and her feet in the cold water because it was the kind of thing you could do when you had been in the saddle for 6 days and were nearly home, and Peter was leaning against a cottonwood watching her with an expression she was beginning to know. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking that I am very glad you did not sign that paper." Bessie looked up at him. "So am I," she said. "Would you tell me something?" he asked. "What were you thinking in the moment you decided not to?" She thought about it, looking at the water moving over the stones. "I was thinking about my father," she said slowly. "I was thinking about what he built and how he built it, 1 year at a time, 1 season at a time, never expecting it to be easy but believing that it was worth it. And I thought the only thing worse than losing the land would be giving it away. And if I was going to fight to keep it, I needed to start by not giving it away. And then you walked out," he said. "And then I walked out," she agreed, "and didn't look back." He came and sat beside her on the flat rock, their feet both in the cold water now, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her and they sat there in the October afternoon with the cottonwoods shaking gold above them and the horses drinking quietly downstream and the world being exactly, precisely what it was. "I should tell you something," Bessie said, "about what I want, so there is no confusion." "Tell me," he said. "I want the ranch and the cattle and the work," she said. "I want to build something that lasts. I want mornings that are early and evenings that are long and winters that are hard and springs that are worth all of it. I want someone beside me who knows what that costs and thinks it is worth it." She paused. "I think that is you." "It is," Peter said. "Good," Bessie said. And she turned and looked at him, and he looked at her, and the distance between them in that moment was very small, and then it was not there at all, because he kissed her the way a careful man kisses someone he values, slowly and with the full intention of meaning it, and she kissed him back the way a woman kisses someone she has chosen with her whole mind, which is completely. The cottonwood leaves fell around them in the wind, gold on the water, gold on the stones, gold in the afternoon light. They arrived back in Redemption on a Thursday afternoon, and the first person Bessie saw in town was Gerald Fitch, who was coming out of the hotel with his traveling bags, which meant he was finally leaving. He saw her and stopped, and there was a long moment in which their eyes met across the street. Bessie reached into her saddlebag and withdrew the envelope she had stopped at the Santa Fe Bank to have prepared, the full settlement receipt with the official bank seal, and she rode over and handed it down to him from the saddle. "That is the full settlement of the Leland debt at the First Territorial Bank of Las Cruces," she said. "Filed and received. Your 30-day notice is void. I believe your business here is finished." Fitch took the envelope and opened it and read it, and the expression that passed over his face was complicated, somewhere between professional disappointment and something that might have been personal relief. "I'll pass this along to my clients," he said. "You do that," Bessie said. "And you can tell Cornelia Hartfield that if she wants to reach her niece, she can write a letter like a proper relative, but if she sends another lawyer, I will not be polite." She turned her horse and rode on, and she did not look back, and beside her, Peter Barnett was smiling. In the weeks that followed, the valley settled into its fall rhythms, the particular quality of October in the New Mexico territory, which Bessie had always thought was the best of the year's seasons, cool and clear and full of a golden light that seemed to understand that it was beautiful and was not in a hurry. The work of the ranch was steady and satisfying, the routine of a place that had been set right and was now doing what it was built to do. Peter was at the Leland place often, and Bessie was at the Barnett place often, and the back and forth of it had a naturalness to it that seemed to surprise no one. Hector Vega, who Bessie trusted more than almost anyone, seemed to approve of Peter with the particular silent approval of a man of few words who showed his feelings through small, consistent actions, which in this case meant offering Peter coffee whenever he came by and discussing the winter grazing plan with him as though he were already part of the operations decisions. Agnes Whitfield invited Bessie to supper one evening in late October and told her over the meal that the whole valley was glad things had worked out, and that it was also extremely obvious that she and Peter Barnett were in love, and that everyone was watching with interest, and that Agnes herself thought it was the most sensible thing either of them had ever done. Bessie said, without quite managing not to smile, "Is it that obvious?" "Completely," Agnes said cheerfully. "And good." On a Saturday in early November, Peter asked Bessie to marry him. He did it in the kitchen of the Leland house, which was perhaps not the most romantic location, but which Bessie thought afterward was exactly right, because the kitchen of the Leland house was where her family had always made its important decisions, at that table under that window with that particular view of the South Range, and there was nowhere more true for such a thing. He had come by to help with the shingle repair on the barn's south side, which had finally been gotten to after weeks of other priorities, and they had worked through the afternoon together, and after, Bessie had made coffee and they were sitting at the table in the early evening light, and he said, without ceremony but with complete sincerity, "I want to marry you, Bessie, if you will have me. I want to spend my life working beside you, and I want us to build something together that is better than either of us could build alone." Bessie looked at him across the table. Outside the window, the South Range was quiet in the evening light, the cattle moving slowly in the distance, the mountains purple on the far horizon, everything that she had refused to sign away and had not regretted refusing for a single moment. "Yes," she said, "I will." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat for a moment in the warm quiet of it, and then she said, "We'll need to figure out the land question. Both properties, the logistics of running both together." He laughed. "I have been thinking about that," he said. "I have some ideas." "Of course you have," she said, and she was smiling and so was he, and it was the kind of smile that two people share when they have known each other long enough to know how the other one thinks, and to find it genuinely pleasing. They were married on the 15th of December, 1882, in the small church in Redemption that had been built the year before, and that the reverend who served the whole valley kept lit and warm for the occasion. It was a clear, cold day with frost on the ground, and a sky so blue it looked painted, and Bessie wore her mother's dress, which had been packed in a cedar chest for years, and which she had taken out and pressed with careful hands, and found that it fit her very well, and that, wearing it, felt like the right kind of continuity. Hector Vega stood in for her father, which was right and proper, and Agnes Whitfield was there with her husband Robert, and Calvin and Luther and Dorotheo and Frank were all there in their good clothes with scrubbed faces, and Peter's sister came down from Albuquerque with her husband, and was a small bright woman named Clara who hugged Bessie warmly and said, "I have been hoping he would find someone like you," with such genuine pleasure that Bessie liked her immediately. The Reverend spoke the words, and Bessie and Peter spoke the words back to each other, and when Peter's hand took hers at the altar, she thought about all the hands they had compared since the beginning, her hand on the fence rail in the livery yard, his hand on the horse's neck, her hand over his cut, his hand covering hers at the table in Santa Fe, and the accumulation of all of those seemed to arrive in this one and make it mean more. They rode back to the Leland place in the afternoon, which was now the Barnett place as well, or rather, as they had decided, was to be called simply the Leland Barnett place, which Bessie thought was the correct solution and which Peter had agreed to without hesitation, and they sat by the fire in the evening with coffee and the remains of the cake that Agnes had made and brought to the church, and it was quiet and warm and entirely right. In the months that followed, the practical business of combining two neighboring operations unfolded with the kind of steady, detailed work that Bessie found genuinely satisfying. Peter moved the bulk of his herd onto the Leland Barnett range, keeping a smaller number at his home place, which they decided to maintain as a secondary operation with two hands. The Barnett stone house they leased to a young family who needed it, which brought in a modest but useful income. The Leland house became the headquarters of their combined operation, and the work of expanding it to properly serve two people's full life together was taken on with energy and some humor. Peter built a new addition on the south side of the house through the winter months, working most evenings after the day's ranch work was done, and Bessie helped with it, which he had expected and was glad of. They worked well together in this as in everything, with a complementary rhythm that meant they rarely stepped on each other, and that problems got solved in the space between their two minds more quickly than either would have solved them alone. Hector Vega became, in this new arrangement, something between a foreman and a family elder, which was the proper acknowledgment of what he had always been. He trained two new younger hands in the spring, and the operation went into the spring gather with 6 capable people, and a herd that had grown through the winter with several good additions. A letter arrived from Cornelia Hartfield in February. It was stiff and formal and contained no apology, but it also contained no further threats. It acknowledged receipt of the settlement, expressed a hope that Bessie was well, and made no mention of the lawyer or the land-holding company or the proposition. Bessie read it once, wrote a brief and civil reply, and filed both letters in the box where she kept important papers. She did not hold a grudge, which she considered a waste of energy, but she did not pursue the relationship either, which she considered a reasonable response to having had a lawyer sent to take your land. What she pursued instead was the life she had chosen, which was rich and specific and entirely her own. Spring came to the New Mexico territory in the way it always came, tentatively at first and then with conviction, the hills going green in the draws where the moisture collected, and the willows along Marta Creek sending out their first yellow-green leaves, and the cattle restless in the pastures, with the particular energy of animals who have been through winter and are glad to be done with it. The first calves came, and Bessie and Peter worked the calving season together with the kind of companionable exhaustion that comes from doing something hard and necessary side by side. And there was a night in late March when they were both up at 2 in the morning with a difficult first-time heifer. And afterward, sitting in the barn with the new calf breathing steadily in the straw, Bessie thought that she had never in her life been more tired or more completely at home. By summer, the operation was running well and producing at a level that Bessie had calculated was the most the land had ever done, a consequence of better management of the combined range and the water rights they had secured on both the Marta Creek flow and the spring on Peter's East Range. The debt was gone, the land was sound, and the life they were building had the solid, tested quality of something built right. In the late summer of 1883, Bessie discovered she was expecting a child. She told Peter on an evening in August when the sun was going down behind the mountains, and they were sitting on the front step of the house, in the tradition they had established without quite meaning to, the evening step-sitting with coffee that was as much a part of their daily life as the morning gather. She told him simply and directly, which was how she did everything, and watched his face change. He set his cup down and looked at her with an expression that she thought was the most unguarded she had ever seen on him, entirely open, the settled, composed quality of him fully set aside in favor of something that was completely and plainly joy. He took her hands in both of his and held them. "Bessie," he said, and could not seem to find more words immediately. "That's the general idea," she said, and she was smiling so broadly it was almost embarrassing. He laughed and pulled her close, and she let herself be held, which was not something she had found easy her whole life, but which with Peter she had come to find natural. And they sat together on the front step in the fading light of an August evening in the New Mexico territory, the mountains dark on the horizon and the cattle quiet in the pastures and the creek audible in the distance, and the world was exactly what it needed to be. The pregnancy went well, as Bessie's constitutionally practical approach to things extended to this as well. She kept working through the fall gather, moderating her pace as necessary and delegating appropriately, which the hands accepted with the matter-of-fact respect of people who knew better than to suggest Bessie Leland Barnett needed to be managed. Peter watched her with a careful attention that she appreciated without always needing, and the balance between his concern and his trust in her judgment was something she found. She loved him for very specifically. Their son was born in March of 1884, in the same house where Bessie had grown up, delivered by the doctor who came out from Redemption, and by Agnes Whitfield, who had delivered most of the Valley's babies for 15 years. He was strong and loud, and had Peter's dark hair and Bessie's absolute certainty about what he wanted, which in the first weeks was primarily to eat and to be held against a warm body, which they arranged. They named him Thomas, for Bessie's father, which had been her suggestion, and which Peter had agreed to immediately, and with a warmth that told her he understood exactly what the name meant and why it mattered. Hector Vega held the baby with the careful reverence of a man who had been around livestock his whole life and knew how to hold something young and precious, and his face in that moment was as open as Bessie had ever seen it. "Thomas Leland," he said, which was not quite the baby's name, but she understood what he meant by it, and she did not correct him. That spring felt like a beginning, which it was. The operation was working well, the land was healthy, the new calves were strong, and there was Thomas Barnett in the house making the kind of claim on the world that babies make, loud and insistent and entirely without apology. Bessie found that motherhood fit her in a way she had not quite anticipated. Not because she was soft about it. She was not. She was as practical about a baby as about a cattle drive. But because she was good at it, and because Peter was good at it beside her, and because the combination of the two of them and this child and this land seemed to form something that was greater than the sum of its parts. Bessie sometimes thought about the paper. Not with grief or anger, but with the particular satisfaction of a decision fully understood in retrospect. It had been a door that closed, And what had opened instead was this. A Tuesday in spring with the light coming through the kitchen window and coffee on the table, and Thomas sitting up in his crib making elaborate commentary to himself about the world, and Peter's voice outside asking Hector something about the east fence, and the mountains in the distance doing what they always did, being there, being permanent, being hers to know. She had not signed the paper and she had not looked back, and looking forward from here, from this kitchen in this house on this land with this life, she thought that the 31st second, the one after the 30 seconds when she might have reached for the pen, had been the most important second of her life. The mountains had been in the window, and she had known herself, and she had stood up and walked out. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are, full of work and weather, and the particular richness of a life lived in close contact with the land. There were hard years among them. 2 dry summers in the mid-80s that tested the range management and required careful decisions about numbers and water, and a winter that came early and cruel and cost them 14 head and a good horse named Magpie that Bessie mourned more specifically than she would have admitted to anyone but Peter. There were also years of abundance, when the rains came right and the prices held, and the cattle were fat and the grass was long into October. In 1886, Thomas had a sister. She arrived in June, which was a better time than March for having a baby, being generally warmer and less chaotic on the ranch. And she was from the beginning a different kind of creature than her brother, quieter and more watchful, with Bessie's gray eyes and a disposition of steady observation that made everyone in her vicinity feel slightly examined. They named her Eliza Margaret, the Margaret for Peter's mother, and she grew from a quiet, watchful baby into a quiet, watchful small person who nevertheless, when she decided to have an opinion, was entirely her mother's daughter in the directness with which she expressed it. Thomas, meanwhile, grew into a boy who was most at home on a horse, which surprised no one, and who had such an instinct for cattle that by the time he was 7 he was sometimes more useful on a gather than the hands, which he was informed of in measured terms, so it did not go to his head. Peter taught him everything, with the patience of a man who understood what it meant to have inherited a love of the land from a father and wanted to give it properly. Hector Vega retired in the summer of 1887, or rather, he told Bessie and Peter that he was going to live with his daughter's family in Albuquerque, which Bessie understood was both a choice he was ready for and something he deserved more than she could express. She told him what he had meant to the ranch and to her family, standing in the yard on the morning he was leaving, and Hector, who was not a sentimental man, had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Your father knew what he was doing when he raised you." She did not cry until he was out of the gate, and then only briefly, and then she went back to work. By 1888, the Leland Barnett operation was one of the more established in the valley, not the largest, not the most showy, but solid and well managed, and with a reputation for good cattle that carried weight at the Santa Fe and Albuquerque markets. Bessie had added 60 acres on the south end, buying it from a family who was moving to California, which extended the winter range considerably and made the operation more resilient to drought. The original East 60 acres that she had considered selling in the desperate planning of that first September were still hers, still part of the land, and she was glad every season that she had not sold them, because they sat over the same water approach that had made them valuable to Hartfield's company, and managing that water well was part of what kept the range healthy. The injustice of what had been attempted against her in those early months was something Bessie had not forgotten, though she had said it in the context of a larger understanding that she had arrived at over the years. There were many ways that the territory took from people, and many of those were worse than what had been attempted against her. She had seen it happen to neighbors who did not have her particular stubbornness, who had signed papers they did not fully understand and found themselves displaced. She had seen what was done systematically to the Pueblo peoples whose land sat under or beside the same water and mineral wealth that brought lawyers in suits from Philadelphia, and the scale of that injustice made her own near loss look modest by comparison. She tried to be a fair neighbor and to conduct her business honestly, and to not participate in the machinery of displacement that was eating up the territory around her. It was not heroism. It was a basic standard that she held herself to with the same seriousness as she held the cattle management standards and the water management standards, because she believed that how a person did one thing was how they did all things. Peter shared this belief. It was one of the things that had made her certain of him early. On a September evening in 1888, 6 years after the morning she had walked out of the lawyer's office in Redemption, Bessie and Peter sat on the front step of the house in the last of the summer light. Thomas was inside with Eliza, there being audible evidence of some disagreement being negotiated, and the mountains were doing what they always did, being there. The valley was going gold in the way it went in September, the particular gold that she had loved all her life, and the air had the first hint of the cool that would deepen into fall, and the cattle were fat on the summer grass in the near pasture, and the creek was running well, and everything was what it was. "I was thinking about Fitch today," Bessie said. "It was not a painful thought. It was the thoughtful kind, the kind that you turned over to look at it from a different angle." "What about him?" Peter asked. "That he thought he was offering me something," Bessie said. "He genuinely thought he was doing me a service. He thought a soft life in Philadelphia was worth more than this." "A lot of people think that," Peter said. "I know," Bessie said. "I used to almost understand it when I was younger. When the land was hard and the work was relentless and everything felt too big, she looked at the mountains. But it's the relentlessness that makes it worth something. The fact that it asks everything of you and gives it back differently. You can't have the view without the hard years. They're the same thing." Peter looked at her with the expression she had come to know best, which was the one where he was listening completely. "That is exactly right," he said. "I know," she said simply, and then she smiled, because she had said it and meant it and it was true. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they watched the September evening settle over the land they had built together, the mountains going dark and the first stars appearing, and the cattle in the pastures, and the light in the window where their children were, and the creek in the distance talking over its stones the way it had always done and would go on doing. The paper with its soft promises was 5 years gone, unread and unsigned and forgotten by everyone who had sent it. The mountains were still there, the land was still there. Bessie Leland Barnett was still here, and she had not signed and she had not looked back. And standing in the accumulated evidence of what that choice had made, she would not have changed one word of it. She reached over and took Peter's hand on the step, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they were quiet in the way that two people are quiet when everything that matters has already been said, and the world is holding them in the particular fullness of an evening that knows it is being loved. And the mountains kept their watch on the horizon, faithful and permanent and entirely themselves. And the stars came out one by one over the New Mexico territory, and the night was good, and the life was good. And it was theirs. Thomas came out onto the step sometime later, 7 years old and already with the long legs of a boy who would be tall, and he pushed himself between them in the way of children who are not uncertain of their welcome, and Bessie put her free arm around him, and Peter ruffled his dark hair. And the three of them watched the last of the evening sky go deep and blue above the mountains. And inside, Eliza had apparently resolved her disagreement and gone to sleep, because the house was quiet. And the world was quiet, and all the things that had been fought for were here, held in the hands that had earned them, and Bessie Leland did not need to look back to know that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was home.